together speech. But he did say at one point that anybody that wanted to use their cell phone had to have it on hands-free. And so he got a laugh at that. That was his bill from years and years and years ago.
Right, it was his bill. It's pretty funny. All right, you ready to call the roll?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here this evening. I'll go ahead and call roll. Vice Mayor Filseth. Councilmember Koo. Here. Chair Scharf.
Here.
Councilmember Tanaka. Here. 4 present.
All right. Do we have any oral communications? Oh, seeing one member of the audience. No card? All right, you want to go with the first item, which is review the draft transportation impact fee nexus study and recommend that City Council consider adoption of an ordinance based on the study's recommendations to consolidate and update the city's transportation impact fee program as anticipated in the city's comprehensive plan adopted on November 13, 2017.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Happy New Year. I'm Hillary Gittleman, the Planning Director. I'm joined by Joshua Mello, our Chief Transportation Official, and Jane Clayton from Hexagon Consultants. Sherry Nixon is also with us from our staff. And we're here today to talk about this nexus study we've prepared in anticipation of updating the city's transportation impact fee program. We thought we'd use a program similar to or a process we used similar to when we updated the housing impact fee. In that case, we brought to the Finance Committee a draft nexus study, got questions and comments. We went back and did some further work on it, came back to the committee, and then got a recommendation basically to prepare an ordinance and bring it to the full council. We thought it didn't make sense to actually draft an ordinance to create the fee until we had your thoughts on the nexus study. So Jane and Josh are going to go through a quick presentation, and then all of us are here to answer your questions.
Thanks.
We're just going to work off the paper copy.
Okay. Okay. So I'll be working off of the PowerPoint that's prepared that you all have a paper copy of. My name again is Jane Clayton.
Does the PowerPoint not work?
Well, usually the staff member has it.
Oh, thanks, Josh. So I'm Jane Clayton from Hexagon Transportation Consultants, and we were hired by the City of Palo Alto to prepare a nexus study to update the transportation impact fees for the city. Looking at the first page, the statewide regulatory context for all impact fees in California is AB 1600. Palo Alto has lots of impact fees, so I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but it's good to remember that what the state law says is there has to be a reasonable relationship between the impacts caused by new development and the projects that are being proposed to mitigate or offset those impacts. And 2 points we want to make specifically that are relevant to this particular nexus study, and that is that impact fees cannot be used to address existing deficiencies, and new development can only be required to address its own share of the problem. The local context for this nexus study is the comp plan update that was recently adopted. The comp plan actually specifically calls for a transportation impact fee, which sometimes I will refer to as a TIF. The comp plan says all new development over a certain size has to prepare a TDM plan. That TDM plan has to meet certain trip reduction requirements based on where they are in the city, and any trips that cannot be reduced through TDM, you pay an impact fee for. So that's the context for this update. So where is Palo Alto right now? There are 4 existing transportation impact fees in Palo Alto, which is a little unusual compared to most cities. And if you flip to the next page, you will see the map. All of Palo Alto is obviously subject to the citywide fee. The 3 other fees are area specific. There is one in the Stanford Research Park area, one over in San Antonio and West Bayshore area, and one along the Charleston or Astrodero corridor, spreading out a certain distance from that arterial. So, And as you can see from the map, there's actually areas where those specific areas overlap, so that a certain parcel can be subject to 3 fees, the Charleston Arrestadero, one of the other 2 areas, plus the citywide fee. But then there's lots of other areas where a parcel might be subject to only 1 fee, which would be the citywide fee. The San Antonio and Stanford Research Park fees both date from the 1980s, and the citywide fee and the Charleston Arrestadero fee were adopted by the city in 2005 and 2007, respectively. The amounts get updated each year, and I've shown the amounts. The key thing here is that the citywide fee is currently charged per PM peak hour vehicle trip, whereas the others are charged per square foot. So, in going about the Nexus study, step 1 is how much new development will there be? And the basis of this Nexus study is the comp plan update. The amount of projected growth is based on this preferred scenario. And so we've calculated that, and the number of trips that would be generated by that is based on the same travel demand forecasting model that was used throughout the update process. And we've calculated how many trips that would be, and the number of trips that would be generated by new development by the year 2030 is 5.7% of the total projected PM peak hour trips. And that's a key number that will come into play again. The next step is to establish that those trips will have impacts, which these fees are designed to mitigate or offset. And the impacts of those additional trips were specified in the comp plan EIR. There were impacts to intersections, to freeways, to local streets, and to transit travel time. The next step is to figure out the improvements to be funded by an impact fee. And a list has been prepared. If you want to see the list to see what the fee is going to pay for, it's included in Table 8 of the attachment. The thing to point out is that it's geographically balanced, has projects all over the city, and it's multimodal, has lots of bike and ped projects in it, as well as intersection enhancements, corridor enhancements, and traffic calming, and some transit projects too. The total price tag of the projects that have been included on the list is close to $1 billion, $954 million. And the city's estimated share, I'm on page 7 of the PowerPoint at this point, is about $405 million. The city's share is based on, in some cases, on some projects, the city would have a 10% share, in some cases it's 20% share, in some cases it's what would be left over after grants that the city expects. Since 5.7% of the PM peak hour trips to be generated would be generated by new development, 5.7% of the city's share of these improvement costs are attributed to new development and should be funded by the citywide TIF. So we take that, basically $405 million, and times 5.7 gets you down to the $23 million that would be funded through this TIF. And when you then do further math, that translates to a new proposed TIF of $8,083 per new PM peak hour trip. This Nexus study recommends that the 3 existing area-specific TIFs, which we showed on that map, would basically sunset when the current balances have been spent on appropriate projects, and that the city transition to a single citywide TIF rather than having 4 transportation-related impact fees. There's multiple reasons for this. A key one is that the nexus studies that underlie those 3 specific TIFs are out of basically old. The projects that were identified to be funded by them either have been done or will soon be done. The basis for the updated TIF is the comp plan, which of course is a citywide document, so it makes sense that it goes along with a citywide fee. And in our experience, it's probably easier for staff to administer and keep track of one fee and what projects can be funded rather than having to figure out what's available in what pot and do we have a project ready to go in it. So the current fee, citywide fee, is $3,575. That fee is updated every year on basically July 1st at the beginning of your fiscal year. This is the current amount. So you can see that the $8,083 is more than doubling the existing citywide fee. Because the comp plan includes a requirement for certain trip reductions to be applied in different parts of the city, we're assuming that if a project comes in and generates, say, 100 trips, depending on the area it's in, you would subtract the number of trips that will be reduced through TDM and charge an impact fee on the remainder. In essence, the city cannot charge an impact fee on a trip that it's requiring the developer to eliminate. I call it, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So I prepared several examples so you can see how the new TIF compares to the existing citywide TIF. The first one, let's take 50,000 square feet. You calculate the number of trips it would generate. Because it's near California Avenue, it's subject to a 35% reduction, and you get the number of peak hour trips generated. Under the existing city fee, that would generate $175,000 for the city. Under the proposed amount, a little over $8,000, you'd generate close to $400,000 for the city. I'm going to note here that if this same 50,000 square feet were downtown, which is subject to a 50% trip reduction requirement, because you're asking that project to eliminate more trips, it's subject to 50% rather than 35% requirement, the fees generated for the city would be a little lower. The proposed fee would generate, in that case, $307,000. The next example is a multifamily units, and it walks through the same thing. It assumes that project would be subject to a 30% reduction, and therefore the existing fee would generate $125,000, and under the proposed fee, $282,000. Third example is an office building in Stanford Research Park. And here we're saying it's going to replace a building that has 100,000 square feet, which is closer to a real-world example, okay? Because there's not a lot of vacant lots sitting around. Almost every new building that is proposed is replacing something. And under TDA, our TIA guidelines, they get credit for it. So the amount, of course, that is generated by the fee is much higher under the proposed fee, but because that Stanford Research Park fee of $1.2 million would go away, the city would actually see less revenue in this case because of the elimination or sunsetting of the Stanford Research Park area fee. The fourth example is a hotel. This is actually modeled directly after a hotel that was recently approved by the city. The resulting citywide fee, as you can see, is much higher under the proposed fee. This also gives credit for the exact amount of space that was being replaced on that site. The Charleston Arrastradero fee, we're assuming would still be charged until that corridor project is complete, but the San Antonio West Bayshore fee would go away, so the city would collect slightly less under this example. The next page gives some transportation, some places call them traffic impact fees, in some nearby cities. There's a more complete table that shows some other cities included in the report. I want to stress that it's not that Palo Alto would charge $12,000 per 1,000 square feet. It's that you're going to charge an amount per PM peak hour trip. But the only way to compare to other cities is to convert that to the 1,000 square feet, because that's how every other city structures their fees. So we have to go through the conversion process in order to give you apples and apples to compare. So the other recommendations, in addition to simply the amount of the fee, is the city now adjusts the TIF every year, new fiscal year. Keep doing that. Cities that don't are always really sorry. Carry forward the existing exemptions. There's certain uses that do not have to pay a TIF, and those exemptions are the same as they are for the community facilities fees. For consistency, those should be continued. A new recommendation is, because retail has a really high PM peak hour trip generation rate, if you charge the amount that, say, $8,000 per PM peak hour trip, it turns out to be really high for most retail projects. So many cities actually discount that because they want to encourage retail development. It has transportation benefits. It reduces your VMT because people maybe can make a shorter trip rather than a longer trip to do whatever errand they were going to do at a neighborhood serving retail store. And of course, the retail generates sales tax for the city. Right now, the exemption is retail under 1,500 square feet is exempt from the transportation impact fee. But 1,500 is a really small amount of space. So most cities that have kind of either provided a discount or exempted retail have a somewhat higher threshold than that. The other recommendation we have is whether to consider exempting accessory dwelling units and junior ADUs from the TIF. Those units are not exempt from other impact fees, the community facilities impact fees. So for consistency, they would, but since the city just passed a new legislation regarding those, if you, in order to encourage them, you could say they don't have to pay the transportation impact fee. And lastly, about vacant parcels, we suggest that if a parcel has been vacant for at least 2 years, you don't give them credit for whatever historically was on that site when you calculate their impact fee. If they're not generating trips recently, they should pay an impact fee on the gross number of trips, not the net. Monitoring the TDM plans, since obviously the city can't charge an impact fee on trips that a developer says they will eliminate through their TDM plan, the city has a very strong incentive to make sure that those trip reductions are actually achieved. So in a new ordinance, or there's now a new language on how that's going to be operationalized in the city to make sure that those TDM reductions actually happen. And And then the last is, I think, okay, so this was creative thinking on my part. The next is, since you're asking the TIF to only fund 5.7% of the city's share of the cost of all the improvements on that project list, how do you fund the other 94.3%? Which I thought, as the Finance Committee, that's like an obvious question, right? We're only asking new development to pay 5.7%. Well, one obvious thing that many cities do is they either add projects to their list or they take projects off their list. But in this case, there's, I think, also the option to say maybe there are some projects that instead of funding only 5.7%, new development can pay 100% of a project. There's 3 projects that were identified as mitigation for significant impacts in the comp plan EIR. Since the comp plan is the basis of this nexus study, you could say, here's a project we want new development to pay 100% of, and all the other things on the list, new development will pay 5.7% of. If you do that, of course, the resulting impact fee goes way up. But that's an option depending on, from a policy point of view, where the city wants its fee to be relative to neighboring cities and what other sources there are to fund some of these projects. And then next steps, which I think Hillary referred to before, is that we'll get your feedback, make any changes you see fit, and then an ordinance will be drafted before it comes back to you and then goes to the full council. So,
Okay.
questions?
Do we have any questions? Go ahead.
So thank you very much for this. This is pretty thought-provoking, actually. Excuse me. So, if I understand the net effect of this, it looks like it will generally lower impact fees in the Research Park and West Bayshore, but raise them everywhere else. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yep.
Any idea what the net is? I mean, it looked to me from the staff report, we raise maybe $11 million or something like that a year in these kinds of fees currently. That's what it looked like in the staff report.
Where'd you see that actually in the staff report?
It is on page 2, summary of existing transportation impacts, approximate funds generated, and it looked like
right.
it tallied up to about 11. So, any idea what?
It would depend on how much, it's very hard to know because you have to know what is likely to be proposed by new development in those areas that are subject to the area fees.
Right.
Even though the hotel was just in that San Antonio Bayshore area, so you just saw a project in that area, in general, most of the development that was projected to happen in that area has occurred. It's not a site of a lot of activity or likely activity based on the comp plan, as I understand it.
Okay. So let me ask. Okay, so
Yeah.
let me ask this then. So if I look at the table of existing impact fees, it's got the Research Park at $4.5 million and citywide at $5 million. And the citywide $5 million, so the Research Park, is that the $4.5 million, is that just the Research Park fee, or is that also their share of the citywide fee as well?
Oh, that's just the Research Park.
That's
fee.
the Research Park fee alone. So the Research Park fee is actually paying some of the citywide. So it looks to me like half of it's coming from the Research Park
Right.
currently.
Yeah.
If I could jump in here, committee member, That's actually the amount of funding that they've generated since inception. It's not an annual amount, and it does not include interest
Oh, and it goes
or
to
income
1989.
earned. Yeah.
That's why.
Right.
So some of them have been
What's
existing for longer.
What's the annual amount?
It obviously depends on the amount of development that's occurring. Some years it's a tiny number, and some years it's not.
Average per year over the last decade?
We'd have to calculate that. We can certainly bring that back.
Okay. I mean, if on average it's $250,000 a year, then probably doesn't matter what we decide here. If it's $20 million a year, then it probably makes a big difference.
Well, most it's 4.5 million since 1989. It's not 20 million a year.
Doesn't sound like it. Doesn't really sound like it, does it? Doesn't really sound like it, does it? Okay. Let me ask a couple more other questions. So the total cost of development, 900,000 or something, 950,000, I think, looks like, grade separation is a pretty big part of that.
Huge part of it.
Right.
600 million was the
And the city,
number.
and the city's share of the 600 million is 250 million, so is that assuming the rest is Measure B?
Yeah, we assumed 150 million per grade separation, which is the going rate on the peninsula, and then we subtracted the 350 million, which would be our anticipated amount of Measure B funding, and we were left with 250 million.
Okay. And then you talked which I thought was kind of interesting, is that retail generates a lot of trips at peak hours, right? On the other hand, I mean, just sort of brainstorming as we go along here, right? I would guess that, the Chipotle on El Camino near Page Mill may generate a lot of trips at rush hour, but they're probably coming from pretty close by. Whereas, a building in the research park, right, half a mile away, I would guess that a huge number of those trips are coming from the East Bay or the South Bay or something like that. And if you look at the worst traffic situations in town, a lot of them are sort of the arteries in and out of town, right? And so if you're sort of looking for reasons to, compare retail trips versus, office R&D trips, they might be different kinds of beasts, and I don't know if you looked at that at all. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, that was mine. Thanks.
If I could just respond to that, we refer to those as pass-by trips. So a lot of trips to neighborhood serving retail would be somebody going somewhere else and stopping at a local, neighborhood serving retail on the way as a pass-by trip.
Anyone else have questions? Just questions? Go ahead.
So how does Stanford Shopping Mall, with the new buildings that went in, does that have a TIF, or are they not considered new buildings? I mean, they added on to their square footage, right?
Yeah, I actually don't think they added net new square footage. I think they have a development agreement that gives them a certain amount, and they would have to come back and we'll do another agreement if they want to increase the total square footage.
Which our comp plan calls for.
Yeah, our zoning
Oh.
calls for that. They've been redeveloping existing square footage quite a bit in the last few
Oh,
years.
so they're just redeveloping what is existing, nothing new added.
In the
They're
last
doing
few
is they're
years.
taking large department stores, tearing them down, and creating small specialty shops with no new increase in square footage.
And if they were responsible for paying a transportation impact fee, they would only pay the citywide fee because they're not within one of the smaller zones.
Okay, okay. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what DU is.
Dwelling units. Sorry.
Okay, no, no. I went through everything looking for that.
Oh, it's probably at first
Sorry,
reference,
I'm
but
sorry.
yeah, dwelling units for residential.
And then forgive me, so, on page 9 of the presentation, you have the percentages for all the different areas. How do you come up with those percentages?
You're on page what?
I'm sorry, 9. Downtown is 50%.
Oh,
Cal-
that's our,
The TDM
we
requirement.
put
That's
that
the
in the TDM
TDM.
requirement.
Okay.
That is now part of the comp plan
Right?
and the mitigation measure included in the comp plan EIR. Those percentages were discussed at great length and are based on what is considered both achievable but aggressive goals based on proximity to transit and other issues for each area.
Those goals at the moment are unproven. Right, if I could say that.
So
Dana?
when they're closer to transportation, like the train, et cetera, then they're higher. And because Stanford Research Park is a little bit further out, that's why they're at 30.
That's correct. And in your staff report, we included the text of a recent ordinance adopted by the council. I think it was earlier this year, or earlier in 2017. Sort of the new program of requiring TDM plans and the monitoring that goes along with that. So it's a little fuller explanation than we included in the PowerPoint.
Thank you.
Okay.
No. Greg, I'll come back to you.
Greg?
Yeah, so thank you for putting this together. I really appreciate it. I have a really basic question, which is why do it differently than all the other cities?
That's a good question. When this citywide fee was first adopted in 2007, and that nexus study was actually done in 2005, the city decided to do it based on per PM peak hour trip. And so this is actually a continuation of how the citywide fee was done before, but I realize it doesn't really answer the question. If you do it per PM peak hour trip, you have the closest possible nexus between how many trips does a project generate and which relates close how much impact it will have and the amount of impact fee. It actually, all the other cities, when they do a nexus study, they go through the same calculation of figuring out how much per PM peak hour trip. But then they convert it to, based on the ITE trip generation rates, to an amount per dwelling unit or 1,000 square feet. And so then they adopt an ordinance that specifies X per 1,000 square feet or per dwelling unit, but they've simply put into law that amount after the conversion. And here it's basically kept at the PM peak hour trip.
But isn't that really debatable, what that is? Like how much a project would generate? I mean, it's kind of somewhat subjective, right? The square footage is really clear cut, right? But how much trips are generated? I mean, it depends on the use, right? I mean, maybe one retailer, no trips, another retailer, tons of trips, right?
Yes, but it's done based on the ITE trip generation rates, which are considered the standard in the traffic engineering
But then you might as well
world.
do the square footage, because aren't you doing the same thing, except you're making people do more math?
Yeah, it is the same thing. It's just other cities convert it to something so a developer can say, oh, I've got a project that's, however, 100,000 square feet, what's my fee? Okay? And here, it amounts to the same thing, yes.
And we're also requiring the adoption of TDM plans for all of the areas shown on that slide. And it would be difficult to account for, if we were using square footage, it would be difficult to say, what reduction in trips we're going to see based on the TDM plan, because we'd be using a square foot calculation and not a per trip calculation. And because we're using this additional layer of TDM plans to reduce the number of trips, we'd be going through kind of a second calculation to get back to trips to then see how the trips are reduced based on the TDM plan. So this eliminates that extra step.
Okay. But back to what the vice chair said, because if you really wanted to kind of get to that, or get to the complete nexus, why not use VMT then?
There's no standard for VMT yet.
I mean, to the point, like, for instance, if a project only generates local traffic, right, it's going to have a really low VMT, right, versus you have one that's going to attract, trips from, San Francisco or something like that, right? Or maybe one's near a Caltrain, and because it's near a Caltrain, the VMT is going to be quite low because everyone's going to take Caltrain, right? Versus if it's in the research park or it's on Bayshore or something like that, right? The VMT would be a lot higher.
So, using trips, a broad brush like trips, also level of service, all you're really doing is looking at localized congestion due to the project. You're not looking at things like VMT and trip length. But, the EIR accounted for trip length when it identified the impacts of the comp plan, because the model that was used to identify the impacts of the, development of the comp plan includes a trip length parameter in it. So it's assigning trips to roads based on the length of trips and where they're going. But, for this type of review, I'm not aware of anybody using VMT yet to calculate a TIF.
We're the only ones using trips too, right? So, are the other cities using trips, or are we the only ones?
The other one that I'm aware of is Los Gatos,
Okay. So
which
they do too.
charges their impact fee per daily trip, which is a very different number than PM peak hour trip. But they also at least do it on a per trip basis.
Well, I guess my point is more,
Yeah.
if you really wanted to be fair, then VMT would be the way to do it, right? Like peak hour VMT or something like that, right? Okay. The one thing that, when I look at this, and I know in some ways you're trying to simplify it, but in some ways it's also a little bit complex. But in some way, the other issue that I think the challenge here is, like what is rent downtown? Do you guys know? Like downtown, like per square foot, roughly? Like $10, right? I heard sometimes even $12 a square foot, right? In some places. But you go to like South Palo Alto, it could be like if you go to like where my old office used to be, which was 101 in San Antonio, it was like $2 a square foot, right? And the thing that strikes me as really not equitable is that you're charging the same fee across the whole city. And there's some parts of the city which, $12 a square foot downtown, no big deal, right? But then you charge the same property owner or a different property owner, like, the same fee that someone gets in downtown. It doesn't seem right. It's a 6x difference in rent. So to me, it's kind of, and not only that, but maybe because they're in downtown, they're in a Caltrain, they're going to get, this trip reduction factor, right? So it's going to be cheaper, which is really ironic because you get much more rent downtown than you do in, let's say, 101 in San Antonio, and yet you can pay a lot. You can pay a lot more, right? And so so it doesn't quite jive with me. Maybe you could explain where my thinking's wrong here.
So regardless of rent, a specific land use generates the same amount of trips, regardless of, what the rent level is for that particular use. This would only apply to new development and redevelopment. It wouldn't apply to somebody occupying
Oh, no, I
an
understand.
existing retail space. I don't want it to seem like we're giving a pass to the developments that are in those zones, where they'd receive a reduction. We have implemented, we're in the process of implementing very stringent TDM requirements where we'll track the TDM plans in the system that we use for permitting. We'll set reminders on when the monitoring reports are due. We've implemented in the muni fee schedule some fines associated with failure to submit monitoring plans for TDM, approved
That's
TDM
my point
plans.
is just more, it seems like, I know you're not factoring rent, but
Yeah.
in some ways it kind of stifles development everywhere else except for downtown, right? Which is maybe what we want, but it's just, you get 6x the rent in one place versus another. So it just,
Well, I guess what I was saying is that I don't want it to look like we're giving a pass to development downtown. The TDM demands would be fairly stringent, and, the money they would be spending on the TDM programs to reduce those trips would be, I'm not going to say it's 100% equivalent, but it would be close to what they would spend to pay that TIF for that trip.
okay. Well,
The other thing I would add is, the reason people pay more in rent downtown is because it's in downtown. It's transit accessible, there are a lot of services.
Sure.
All those things contribute to more walking, biking, transit trips. So all of this is kind of a system that works together, and the end result is a fee structure and this kind of TDM plan where people downtown have a higher obligation to make a higher investment in trip reduction and therefore they end up paying somewhat less in
Well, it's also
impact
cheaper
fees.
to develop because,
Can I take a shot at this too? I mean, if I understand correctly, the function of this, it's to help fund transportation improvements designed to get people back and forth to this specific location. And so the real gravity is to the cost of the transportation improvements. And so it doesn't really matter whether it's $2 a square foot for rent or $8 or $20 a square foot for rent. It's really tied to the cost of, that transportation project as opposed to what the applicant can afford to pay.
And every trip in the city has an impact, whether or not you generate it from downtown or you generate it.
no, I get it, but the properties in downtown could probably afford a much
Yeah,
higher TIF than,
We can always subsidize other people. I don't know, subsidizing things fair?
um,
I don't think necessarily subsidization
yeah, well, I think,
equates to fairness.
yeah, I guess for me, I'm just trying to understand it from the kind of equity perspective. Speaking about equity perspective, so roughly, do you guys know how much more expensive property is in Palo Alto versus, let's say, Menlo Park? Do you think
Can you
it's,
ask that again? I'm sorry.
do you know how much more expensive property is in Palo Alto versus Menlo Park?
Oh,
In general.
From the developer, if they were going to.
No, just in general,
Oh,
roughly.
like rent?
Rent, sure.
No, we don't have that data.
I mean, so if we were just to say, let's use these fees as a reference point, right? This would say that Palo Alto's property is 3x that of Menlo Park for office, and about maybe, 2 to 3x for,
No, it has nothing to do with that. What it's really saying is that there's a certain amount of improvements we need to do, and that you're going to generate X number of trips. It's simple math, right? You're going to generate so much trips, and so that trip equates to needing more traffic improvements, and therefore you pay it. If we'd added in, if Menlo Park has no improvements to do in their city, their fee would be very low. If they had huge amounts of improvements, and that's why I think you look at the North Bay Shore North Bay Shore fee out in Mountain View, it's because they have a huge amount of infrastructure improvements they need to do. So that's what it equates to. It has nothing to do with land values. It has nothing to do with, it's purely the dollar amount of the infrastructure that needs to be done relative to the number of trips that are generated.
I hear you on that. And I was, what I'm expressing is just another perspective. Where if you look at relative to land value, it seems like rather high to just about every other city. So that's my point. Now, I understand what you're saying, because I saw the calculation, so I know how it's done, right? So I understand that.
Hope
But,
so.
but then if you look at relative to land value, it seems like a much higher percentage.
So we were doing questions. I actually think that that was a comment.
Oh, okay, I didn't
I mean,
realize.
no, we were doing
comments?
questions.
Okay, no problem. Okay, I'll save the rest of my comments later then.
Right, okay. So, you had another question?
I have two more questions, actually.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Which one of these programs is simpler to administer? Or does it matter?
Well, one thing's for sure, administering one fee, citywide fee, is a whole lot simpler than administering 4 overlapping fees.
Got it.
And we calculate the trips regardless of, I mean, that's part of our review.
And then the next question is, I think goes back to what you said, which is, this does not seem like it's very much money, okay? $11 million over 30 years, if I read that right. So it's not going to fund a whole lot of, major transportation projects across the city, and partly because it's only 5.7%. Now, I guess my question is, are we required, the 5.7%, right? Are we required that, to sort of take an average view of the cost here, that is new developments, if the new development is 10% of all development, then they get 10% of the total cost and so forth, or are we allowed to take a marginal view, okay? Which is to say, to consider it the other way, applicants come to us and they say, gee, you want me to put one more parking spot in, that means I got to put a whole second floor of my garage in, okay? So, that one more parking spot costs me like $20 million or something like that. That's the marginal one. I suppose we're not allowed to do that in this and say, that next car, that's the one that requires us, okay, to put in a monorail system. Right? Are we allowed to do that at all?
Alas, no. I mean, I think my understanding of the Mitigation Fee Act, and we'll certainly, check in again with our attorneys on this, because I want to talk to them about Jane's idea of the specific mitigation measures, going for 100% of that, and whether you could put that in the research park in San Antonio or something. But we'll ask them or confirm that. But my understanding of the Mitigation Fee Act is you really have to use this methodology where it's 5-point-something% of the trips. The trips are what's causing the need for the improvements, and so you charge the new development the 5-point-whatever%.
Got it, okay. Because it isn't very much money, so it doesn't fund a lot of transportation. And in fact, in our transportation systems at 50% capacity, marginal costs of transportation are low, and when it's at 98% capacity, marginal costs are very, very high, right? So,
All right.
I guess that was a comment.
So I just had a couple of questions. So if we have a Cal Avenue guy who says, look, I'm proposing a 50% TDM reduction for my property, he pays less fee, and then we go less this fee, right? So these aren't the caps on your trips, right? So somebody could do a TDM plan on California Avenue and say, I want to have 50% trip reduction, therefore I'm paying less. And then we're going to fine them, I assume, if they don't meet it, right? We're going to have teeth. These seem to go together to me. So you're updating the municipal code ordinance for that reason, right?
We updated it already, but if we need to strengthen it further, we will.
All right. So I'm correct, right? I mean, you could.
Yeah, in theory, you could say, hey, I got, you're asking me to reduce my trips by 35%, but I'm going to do 50. And you'd have to demonstrate to us that you could really do that. It would have to be believable to our professionals in the field.
So if you have a low-income housing project, you typically generate less trips, right? I mean, doesn't low-income housing generate less trips?
If it's 100% affordable housing, it's exempt from the TIF.
It's not exempt until we say it's exempt.
Well, it's one of the exemptions that's currently specified.
Well, we might get rid of all the exemptions,
Okay. True. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure why we have exemptions for some of these things.
Yeah.
So I want to understand why. So take affordable housing projects, right? My understanding is a lot of these affordable housing projects have very low trip generation, or lower trip generation than they normally would.
Yeah, I think the
I'm thinking
data
I
would
said an
support.
affordable senior housing project,
Yeah.
like Stevenson House, has like no trip generation.
That's right. The data would support there are not a lot of single occupant vehicle trips during the peak hour. from
So
that.
my question is when we look at a low-income senior housing project coming to us, assuming it wasn't exempt, would we look at some Traffic Institute study that's particular to that project? We would. So they would get credit for that. A low-income housing project, we want them to have TDM programs as well. And at least I want them to have TDM programs. I mean, they create impacts just like everyone else. So if we go ahead and exempt them, what would be their incentive to do the TDM programs?
So if I could jump in here, the ITE trip generation manual does not differentiate between the cost of housing, whether it's, regular, full price or below market rate. It's based on the housing type. So a townhouse would generate fewer trips than a single family.
So that's different than
home.
what you said.
But they could demonstrate to us that, through a survey of other similar properties or similar developments in Palo Alto, and we're actually undertaking a study of parking demand for different types of housing in Palo Alto. If they could demonstrate to us that they would have a lower trip generation rate, that's something we would entertain. And on top of that, they could also add in some TDM measures that would then have to be submitted as a formal TDM plan that would be monitored and enforced.
Good, because that's where I was going. I didn't want them to get caught up in the wrong. I wanted them to pay for only the trips that they actually have, and I want them to have an incentive not to create trips.
And just practically, for an affordable housing project, if they maintain their exemption, those usually require a discretionary action. We have an opportunity to impose conditions that still require the TDM plan.
Right. So I wanted to just basically go to the exemptions. They were somewhere. I can't remember where they were. I know they're in the staff report. I could look at that.
They're on page 15 under other recommendations. Oh, they're also in the report, on the,
In the presentation, there are page 15 of the presentation.
Page 15 of the front, right.
Yeah, in
That's
the middle.
actually hard to read.
yeah.
Is there there's a table or something in here. I know I saw it. Current listing, page 5, right? So, I actually think retail's the hardest, but you just gave an example of how we would do it. I mean, I don't really want to exempt retail, but I don't want to overcharge them either. And so, the example you gave me for below market rate housing, would we take the same approach and say that, or would it be impossible? Because it's really a VMT issue, I mean.
So, typically when we're reviewing trip generation, from the staff side, we'll use the IT trip generation manual, but we are open to alternative methods of calculating trip generation. So if a developer
So
proposed
what's
to
an
do a survey
alternative-
of,
What's an alternative trip that would catch which is the VMT issue when it comes to retail? Whether we think retail actually may, unless it's destination retail, which we don't have much of in the city, a lot of it is not trip generating. And,
so the IT manual does break it up by type of, pass-by trip, and a single point A to point B trip. So, I mean, a lot of this occurs, when we bring items to you, through the entitlement process. We'll have a discussion about methodologies that were used to calculate the trips. Sometimes there's alternative methodologies used, like a survey of comparable properties or comparable retail establishments. But IT is kind of the starting point.
I'm assuming a lot of this won't come to us. I mean, you build a zoning compliant building, it's got ground floor retail. Why would that come to us? I mean, it goes to ARB, then it gets approved, no one appeals it, So, I mean, so the question is, I don't need it to come to us. What I want to do is I want to know how staff would recommend that we capture the retail issue. If you think that, I mean, I heard some sympathy for retail from you guys. And so the question is, how do we capture that to protect retail from this without, I could make it up. Let's charge retail 50% of the trips, but I'm.
Well, that's the recommendation in the report, is to do 50% reduction for neighborhood serving retail under 50,000 square feet. 50,000, 50.
Why don't we just say retail? I mean, how do you define neighborhood serving retail? I mean, how do you do it?
The reason for the 50,000 is you don't want to provide a cheaper impact fee for big box stores.
We don't have any big box stores.
Right, so it won't come up, but
Okay, so why don't we
the
just
point
say all
is,
retail under
they
50,000?
they create tons of traffic and have long VMT, long trips. But neighborhood serving retail has shorter trips, and that's why the 50% discount is proposed.
For all retail that's under 50,000 feet. I mean, that just seems clear. Okay, all right, I could support that.
That was the argument, is the shorter trips to retail?
So I apologize.
There's several arguments, but that's a key one.
So I apologize, I didn't see that. Where is that?
It's also on page 15, the hard-to-read slide.
Yeah, that's really hard to read. So I'll take a little bit of all right.
Third bullet.
Got it. All right. Okay. All right, I don't think I have any more questions. Let me see. Oh, ADUs. If we exempt ADUs, they obviously pay nothing. If not, do they typically generate, is it 2 bedrooms, they generate 2 trips, is that it? Or it's a PM trip, what are we talking about? Is it a single-family rate? Or?
Yeah, it's a small dwelling unit. What is that, 10 trips a day, some percentage during the peak hour? I mean, what's the ballpark?
There is no ITE rate for ADUs. It's kind of a new area. And so I've never seen a trip rate developed for that. I expect there will be in the future. So if it was, a 1 or 2 bedroom, you'd probably charge the same as you would based on a single family home, right? Or you could say we want to do the multifamily. I mean, you kind of, it's professional
Multifamily
opinion.
less.
It's multifamily, so you would use that trip rate probably.
From the staff perspective, we'd probably use a hybrid of single-family, multifamily,
Is a
and split the
multifamily less?
difference, or, yes.
Yes. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
lower.
why would it be more than a multifamily apartment? So, what is that number? I'm just trying to
Single-family
decide
home is 9 trips per day.
What's a
I'm not sure what the rate is for multifamily, do you know?
For PM peak hour or for,
well, it's the PM peak hour that we're using for the trip generation.
right,
So that creates the fee.
exactly. So that's the relevant fee here. It's about half. It's about a 0.5 per unit. It says every unit, for 2 units, 1 person is going to make a trip.
Okay.
Okay.
Why are we using PM peak? Why PM rather than AM, or why PM?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of industry practice, and actually during the comp plan process, we talked about changing it to peak period instead of peak hour. We got a lot of pushback from Stanford, among other things, and decided, hey, just stick with the industry standard.
I was just
And
curious.
PM is more congested than AM generally.
Okay. So these other things, hazmat storage. Does hazmat storage generate trips? Why is this an exemption?
Run away.
I guess it's exempt because it doesn't really generate trips.
I mean, cafeterias, if cafeterias generate trips, I mean, I don't know why they would be exempt. And when all of this was on a square footage basis, I understand some of these exemptions, and I would have supported them. And so what I'm thinking is that, with the exception of day schools and preschools, because I could see, but do daycare people pick up their kids? And I actually don't think, I think we want to encourage daycare, I mean, in a way that's different. And I think those are like retail, those are really local trips. People usually have daycare next to their house or next to their employment. So they're all pass-by trips, in my view. They're totally different kinds of trips. I'm not sure I would exempt anything here.
If I could just, it's on-site cafeteria, recreation, and childcare for employees only is the full exemption. So the thought is that it's on-site at the workplace. So it's not going to generate an additional
I
trip.
assume it doesn't, but the point is why do you need an exemption for something that doesn't generate trips when, we're not doing it on a square, when you were doing it on a square foot basis. Now what you're telling me is that we take a project, and your project could be, could have 20,000 square feet of space that has no people in it. I'm thinking of research and development done by robots. I'm making it up. But I mean, the point is, if you had that 20,000 square feet, we would have no trip generation. We wouldn't charge for that under this model, I assume. No? If I'm wrong, tell me. So I just, all right.
The one thing I'd like to check is 100% affordable projects. I think there's something in our housing element, I was just looking for it, saying that we exempt them from impact fees. So that's one that we might want to perpetuate if I can find that reference.
Okay. All right, comments?
One more.
Or one more question, go ahead.
So unless I missed it, how about senior community centers? Is that something that is considered for exemption, or how is the trips generated for that?
It's not one of the current exemptions, so if someone proposed a, net new use that had a trip generating footprint, we'd have to analyze it, charge a fee.
Is it public? Is it a public building or not?
Yeah.
Okay.
Avenidas, right?
Public buildings are currently exempt.
Oh,
And these exemptions, honestly, is probably a case of things getting grandfathered in. These are the same exemptions that are applied to all the Palo Alto's community facilities fees. So I have no idea what the history is of why different uses were made exempt. There has probably, from a staff point of view, been an advantage to the fact that the transportation fees and the exemptions for the community facilities fees are the same. They don't have to keep track of two lists of exemptions.
That's a really good point. Just in terms of administering a new fee, it would be really difficult if the exemptions for this one didn't match all the other ones.
Maybe you should bring us the other one.
We'll put it on the list. We'd probably have to update the Nexus studies, or at least open them up and look at them to adjust those exemptions. So we are a little bit, be nice to keep it simple, but we'll see.
But if they're exempt and they don't generate any trips anyway, it doesn't really make a difference, right?
It doesn't. Shouldn't make any difference at all.
Well, I'm just asking about, community centers. There are trips that are generated over there.
There are.
Plenty, too. But if they're public buildings, then, does the TDM go into play? How does that work to encourage those trips?
Yeah, that would be a use downtown. It would be subject to the 50%. They have to do a TDM plan. I mean, I don't really know, I don't have the details on how that got through the process and what the use was considered and how this was factored in previously. But under this new program, we would look at the number of trips generated, we'd require a TDM plan, and we'd charge a fee based on the remaining trips.
Now, for example, so with Mitchell Park, being a new building, is that an infill? Is that exempt because it was
yeah.
prior to the
And that is a
2000
public building, so that wouldn't be charged a fee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
Okay, speaking about exemptions, I'd actually largely agree with what Councilmember Scharf said about the exemptions. I think retail, daycare, it makes sense to have, because those are desired uses. It makes sense for those to be exempt, and I guess public buildings, because why we tax ourselves, right? Doesn't make sense. So those three make sense, and I think the rest of them, unless there's some really good reason, I support what Councilmember Scharf said in terms of whether we want to support, continue to have those exemptions or not. And, in terms of having retail exempt under 1,500 square feet, like it says on page 15 of the slides, under 1,500 square feet, or, for retail serving retail, neighborhood serving retail, less than 50,000 square feet. I actually agree with Scharf also on this because, retail uses change, and it's like maybe it's neighborhood serving today, and tomorrow it's not neighborhood serving, right? So what do? You say you got to pay up now because it gets very, very complex. And so I'm in favor of just saying retail rather than trying to say, well, it's retail if it's under 1,500 square feet, or retail that's neighborhood serving, which is kind of a fuzzy thing, and it's also changes, right, depending on what the use is. So I think we should make that simplification. And
I'm sorry, can I just clarify? So you're saying preserve the 1,500 square foot
no, I'm just saying just
exemption?
call it retail.
Or get,
Just
okay.
say if retail's exempt.
Okay.
Well, right now, I don't think
Okay.
retail is exempt. It's at 50% is their recommendation.
Oh, well, maybe just make
We
it
have an
exempt, or
exemption
make it
for
all 50% or
1,500
something
square
like that.
feet or
All
less.
50% is.
All 50% or something like that, where because I think the problem with although I could see now why you would want to have. I would actually be in favor of having all retail exempt, just because retail is. If we want to have local grocery stores, if we want to have that kind of stuff, I think that's going to be required. I'm not
Are
sure
you-
if my other council members agree with that, but
Sorry, just a point of clarification. Today, all retail under 1,500 square feet is exempt, completely exempt, no fee. Our recommendation is to reduce the TIF fee by 50% for retail under 50,000 square feet. So it's two
yeah, but
different.
My point though is neighborhood, like what Councilmember Sharp asked, what's neighborhood serving, right? And I was just thinking, wait a second, what's neighborhood serving today may not be neighborhood serving tomorrow, and so. And you only charge this when you first do construction, right? So, in the next 50, 100 years when things are transitioning through, like what happens, right? So,
Nobody builds a 1,400 square foot retail building. Right? Yes. I'm with Councilmember tonight. Keep it simple, retail or not retail.
Yeah, that's fine. No one does that.
Yeah, so,
Watch tomorrow, someone will build a 1,400.
Yeah, I think
Well,
we're
there's
probably
this
get
little-
a mixed-use
I'm gonna
building that
sell
has a
those at my
1,400 square foot
ADU.
retail space in it.
yeah, so I mean, I would be in favor of actually just having all retail exempt. Because I think if we want to have retail that we can walk to that's in Palo Alto, I think that's going to be necessary. One other thought I had is on the vacant parcels. So why not also have it for vacant buildings? So what if the buildings, what if it's not a vacant parcel, but it's been a vacant building for 2 years? Isn't that almost the same kind of idea? In fact, maybe it's worse because you have
Yeah,
a vacant
it
building.
really should read vacant buildings and parcels.
Okay,
If something has been out of operation for more than 2 years,
okay,
we
okay,
would
that's
charge
what you
the
intended
TIF.
then.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes more sense.
And this is an issue where we would welcome your input. We tossed around 5 years, 3 years, 2 years. I think this is a
Well,
question.
I think vacant property is kind of a waste, right? So I think this encourages some utility out of it, which is generally a good idea, right? I mean, you have ghost houses, you have, there aren't too many vacant office buildings, but, you know, although we have the History Museum, right? That's been vacant for, what, 10 years? I don't know, but
20,
20 years, okay.
30.
I don't know.
I could see, though, a large parcel in the research park could take several years to redevelop, so, I
Yeah,
don't know.
I
There's
don't
an
know if 2 years
argument
is the
for
right thing,
longer.
but I staff was thinking vacant buildings as well, which would help get rid of the ghost houses. That seems to make sense to me. Yeah, those are my comments, thanks.
All right. All right, so what you're looking for is a motion to approve this? Is that basically what
Yeah,
you're looking for?
or direction to prepare an ordinance and bring it either back here or straight to the council.
All right, well, I would move that we prepare an ordinance, direct it. Before I do that, I have one question. Could we keep the fee in the Stanford Research Park? Could we keep this fee in the Stanford Research Park? Or no, or basically we're done with it because we've done all the improvements?
We would need to do a new nexus study and identify additional projects, and we actually just emptied that entire fund and transferred funding to the county to build the Page Mill Road improvements at El Camino, Hanson, and Hanover. So a lot of the nexus study projects from that TIF have been completed or will be completed.
But I do want to consult with the city attorney about this idea that Jane posed, that there are a couple mitigation projects that we could potentially fund 100% of the improvements through a TIF. And two of those, directly serve the research park. So we'll investigate that further.
So what were these three projects again? They were on page,
It's slide 17 at the bottom.
right?
Um,
You know,
so,
Foothill and Page Mill.
I'm really
yeah.
uncomfortable. Well, so what you do is it would increase the citywide number? Is that what you're talking about?
What I want to ask the attorneys, I don't know the answer to this, is
I mean,
whether we could increase the locally in the research park or the area that would directly benefit from these
Well, I mean, I think the
improvements.
whole city benefits from Page Mill, from Foothill, and from a citywide calming traffic program. I mean, citywide calming
Oh,
traffic
yeah,
program.
the first one definitely.
So, I don't know, I think you could make it really expensive in certain parts of the city if you're going to fund 100% of these, and I think they benefit the entire city. So, I mean, I don't know, it seems to me, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to see the numbers, but, I mean, if you really want to consider that, I don't think we're doing anything tonight.
It's up to you. I think it might be something to explore. If the numbers look good, we can bring them back to you with a draft ordinance, and we can see if we want to go that way or not. It could be that the attorneys say, oh, you can't do that, in which case it's a
Well, it's a little
non-starter.
unclear to me why Foothill Expressway and Page Mill Road corridor improvements don't benefit the entire city. I mean, that's how I go out to 280, I don't know about the rest
Oh,
of you.
yeah, I'm sure they do, and I'm sure you could increase the citywide fee based on these. The question is whether you could
Well, aren't
make
they
some
already in the citywide fee? These are already in the citywide fee.
at 5-point-something%.
Right.
Not at 100% or some larger percentage.
It's actually lower than that. We assumed, I think, a 10 or 20% local match for those projects, and then it's only 5.7% of that local match. Because these would be county projects and we'd need to contribute a local match, but we assumed the county would bring the bulk of the funding. We could also look at that and see if we want to contribute, over and above what the local match would be to move these a little faster. That's something we could also look at and come back to you with.
I guess the question that I'm asking without asking it is whether we think there's going to be concern that in some areas of the city, like the Research Park and the San Antonio corridor, the fees are actually going to go down, while in other parts of the city, the fees are going to go up. And if that's troubling to you, I guess I'm
I haven't
offering.
heard anyone express any trouble over it.
Okay. I was
I don't know,
offering to
unless I
explore
heard
that
something
further.
different,
Okay.
you know? All right, I'll just move that we approve this. And I guess with a 50% retail, that's what you guys wanted.
You want to get rid of the exemption?
I want to get rid of all the other exemptions with the, I want to have us, with the, we're going to keep, are we keeping public facilities?
We can't get rid of public facilities, right? So that's
That would be our pocketbook.
Oh, my God, the city might have to pay fees that it imposes on itself. You know? We actually usually do pay the fees we impose on other people for development.
yeah.
We always do. So, I mean, it is questionable to me of why we don't pay those fees as a city. Because we pay every other one.
Public safety building.
Well, I mean, that's, I'm torn between it because, I don't want to increase the cost of the public safety building, but I actually don't feel strongly on that.
I mean, the public facility argument is you're just moving our money around from one pot to another, right, basically?
Right. That's the argument.
I would allocate it to I would not exempt public buildings too, because we're moving money around from one pot to another, but at least we're being more accurate about which pot it's in.
And also, we had then do some TDM for
Yeah, that's true.
our own public facilities, which is probably a worthwhile thing to do. Yeah, so I guess, what exemptions would you do, Vice Mayor?
As few as possible. The affordable housing one is beyond our ability to influence, right? So that's it.
I'll confirm that. If it's mentioned in the housing element as something we're committed to, we'll keep it.
I wouldn't do any exemptions.
Okay, so no exemptions except for the affordable housing one. But we do give retail a 50% break.
All retail or retail under 50,000?
All
square
retail
feet?
under 50,000. You want to do all retail?
Well, we don't have any retail over 50,000.
I know, we don't.
All retail.
So all retail.
I'll second.
All right. You want to speak?
Yeah, I'll speak to my second for a second. I'm not going to propose this as an amendment. Oh, did you move that it comes back to finance or it goes directly to council?
I'm happy to go to council, but if there's any particular reason.
I'm not going to propose this as an amendment, but I think when it goes to council, it would be helpful if there was some kind of estimate of what the revenue and per year revenue impact is going to be. I mean, just looking at this, first of all, $11 million over 30 years is $300,000 a year or something like that, so it's not a huge amount. To first order, my guess is if you double it citywide but take Stanford to zero, it stays about the same. Right? But that said, if you folks could have some kind of estimate prepared for revenue impact, that'd be great.
Yeah,
Just so everybody knows the magnitude of the stuff they're dealing with. I mean, right. So,
this seems like a really small revenue generation. And it seems like this shouldn't be spent an inordinate amount of time on something like this with the council. I'm actually hoping we get a unanimous vote, because I don't really think council should spend its time debating something that raises virtually no money on an annual basis.
we might like to, though.
Well, people always want it. But, Councilmember Koo?
Could you be clearer about this motion?
Yeah, the motion is to go with the staff recommendation, right? But the only thing that's different is the exemptions.
Eliminate the exemptions
So we basically said eliminate the exemptions
and 50% of all retail.
and 50% of the retail, which staff recommended. And the argument for 50% of the retail is that's actually more close to what its actual real trip generation is. And that's,
So not even carry forth the existing, the ones that we currently have?
right, that's correct.
Eliminate all of those?
Right. 'Cause
Even
they
the
generate
daycare?
trips. You know, if you're concerned about daycare, we
No,
could
I
have an
mean, I'm
exemption.
just asking, I want to be clear.
Yes, no, I was going to say get rid of all of them. But I could see daycare. And I would actually argue that daycare should be like retail at 50%. Or we could have daycare. I mean, I'm fine with having daycare. but-
Nobody builds a new daycare center.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I'm fine with having daycare. if people-
Well, you know, it's just, yeah, I don't care.
Well, actually, I care.
Okay, so you want daycare.
So,
daycare.
you know, my kids are older now, but I can tell you it was really hard finding daycare. And, you know, I know someone else is looking for daycare. And, you know, like, and Palo Alto is really expensive. Both parents usually have to work, right? That means the wife and the husband have to work. And so daycare is really hard, right? And so you want to encourage it.
Okay, you sold me.
So,
Done, but you understand that this doesn't impact any existing daycare.
I understand. But the other thing that, you know, and the other thing that, you know, people move to Palo Alto for are the schools. And so I think we do want world-class schools here. So, you know,
I don't like that one. If we're going to subsidize, if we're going to charge public buildings, we ought to charge schools too.
Right.
It does, it's a traffic, it does generate traffic, and we do have to.
I'm not even sure we have the right to charge schools, right? Public schools? So not public schools, we don't have a right to charge. No public schools will be charged.
okay. Okay, and just to clarify, so the vacant parcels, basically
And vacant buildings,
vacant buildings. Okay, so that's still here.
yes.
Okay.
All right, is that clear to everyone? Clear to staff?
And staff is going to check on the 100% affordable housing.
Correct, because if it's in the housing element, we leave it
Right. And
Sorry.
it may take us a little time, but we'll prepare a draft ordinance and go straight to council.
on consent, if it's for.
There's a elaborate notification process for fees like this, so we'll probably have to do a public hearing.
Oh, you have to do a public hearing anyway?
So is it a 50% reduction for retail and daycare, or is daycare completely exempt?
Daycare is completely exempt.
Okay.
That's what I heard from Councilmember Tanaka.
And then 50% for retail.
Correct. All right. All in favor?
Aye.
That passes unanimously. Hey, Greg, can you get me a thing of, like, this?
22nd at the council meeting about the infrastructure plan and the funding challenges that we're faced with. So just kind of up front, I'm going to review a few of the more pertinent slides from the January 22nd presentation pretty quickly, and then turn it over to Kylie for some more of the presentation. So this slide we looked at a couple weeks ago shows the funding sources from the initial infrastructure plan with what we had in June of 2014. $136 million in funding sources there. Key thing to point out again is there's a range of sources, but about half of this is coming from the transient occupancy tax, including the voter approval increase from 2014 that's supporting the plan. And then this is the chart that shows kind of our current schedule of when design and construction on the 9 infrastructure plan projects would occur. To reiterate again, that's kind of under the assumption that all the funding for all the projects was in place, which is, of course, what we're discussing. And I just point out that we may want to refer back to this chart as we have the discussion with the committee to identify projects that are not in process yet or early enough that we might consider them for deferring as part of the overall strategy. And then this is where we looked at kind of the bottom line of where we think we stand right now in terms of what we have budgeted in the projects and our current estimates and shortfall. So you'll see kind of the bottom line there. We're at about $180 million budgeted for the 9 projects, but our current estimates are at about $235 million, which leads to that shortfall figure of $56 million. We pointed out in the report and at the bottom of this slide that there is about $5.7 million in other funding that's been identified that are from sources like parking in lieu fee funds that can support the projects. So essentially the gap that we're facing right now on the infrastructure plan is about $50 million. But then I would also point out again that we're in the design process, working through the ARB review process on some of these big projects like the Cal Ave Garage and Public Safety Building, and those are in flux, and I do expect that we'll likely see some more increase in estimates on those projects.
You know, I need to stop you there. Do you have a sense when you say that?
Microphone, please, Chris.
Sorry, are we talking a 15% increase kind of thing, or 20%? Are we talking?
I think we're talking more like 5 to 10%.
Can you go through each of these projects and basically say, like, public safety building, you think that probably goes up 10%, or highway, bike, and bridge, are we at 16.3, or do you think that's?
I'd be happy to do that.
I think that'd be really helpful.
Sure. So the public safety building, we've recently been to the ARB. We've got some significant changes to the design as a result of that, and we're working on an updated cost estimate right now.
You do recall that we said you could come back to council
Yes.
and override the ARB if we thought it was appropriate.
I do recall, and we're in the process just now of trying to assess the increases. That's one that I would estimate could increase somewhere in the range of 5 to 10%, maybe less than 10%.
So
but
we're
I
talking
wouldn't
about
expect it
$4 to
be.
$10 million, or $4 to $9 million.
And I'm just giving you a sense of
No, I
of
want
my
that.
thoughts
No,
on
no,
the.
look, I'm
yeah.
not going to hold you to
Okay.
it, Brad. I'm not going to come back and say, I'm just trying to think if we're going to start thinking about how much money we need to come up with.
I understand.
It's good to have some sense.
The bike pedestrian bridge, I'm not anticipating increases to that project. The bike pedestrian plan, we're not expecting increases. Charleston, Arostradero corridor, there may be a small increase to that project, probably less than $1 million. Although that's also, first phase of that is out to bid. So very soon we'll actually have some bid numbers to compare to estimates. Bixby Park project, design on that hasn't even begun yet, and the scope is not clearly defined. The California Avenue parking garage, that's another one where I'd expect to see probably increases in the 5 to 10% range. Downtown parking garage, there's no updated design on that at this time, so that there could be changes in the future, but I don't think they would be very significant. Fire Station 3 replacement, that is the one project of these that we're kind of locked in, assuming all goes well with our project that's now under construction. We know the cost of that project at $8.6 million. Fire Station 4 replacement, we haven't even begun design on this project yet, and that's an old cost estimate number. So when that does eventually move forward, it will probably be significantly higher.
When you say significantly higher, any sense?
Well, let's see. The Fire Station 3 and 4 estimates were initially compiled at the same time, and we went from 6.7 on Fire Station 3 to 8.6.
So another couple million?
So probably another couple million. And the last column there is not a project, staff salaries and benefits.
All right. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Brad.
And the JMZ, we just allocated another $3.5 million for last night, and that's not part of.
We are getting there next. So good evening.
Well, there's also the Ranger Pipeline project, right? Which
I'm sorry?
the Ranger Pipeline project is what, $3-4 million over downtown.
Oh, the
University
downtown?
project? There's a general fund component of it, but the majority is enterprise fund.
Correct. Okay, so good evening. I'm going to continue this presentation and actually layer on the questions that the committee is asking about, those competing priorities that we're all aware of. We've tried to summarize them for us here. So first, we obviously have what we've discussed at length, which is the forecasted 2.6 million gap that we will be making sure we balance towards in our operating budget in the general fund. Additional operating funding needs that are coming up over the near term include labor agreements. So the committee is aware we have probably about 6 contracts that need to be negotiated over the next 12 months. We have the unfunded liabilities that we want to address as an organization for both pension and retiree health care. We're in the negotiation stages with a number of service agreements, and so those may have operating costs. And obviously, coming to the Finance Committee next meeting will be further discussions about our parking programs and any enhancements to that on the operating side. On the capital funding side, as the committee alluded to last night, the council approved the Junior Museum and Zoo Phase 1, so that's that initial $4 million additional cost. Now, there's also the potential for Phase 2. You know, we have the animal shelter as an organization, whether or not we want to replace that or just renovate it. West side fencing, the parks master plans, probably in the $40+ million range. Cubberley master plan, we're just working on developing right now, as opposed to we don't necessarily know the future. We have a bunch of city-owned assets upcoming, or Roth and Avenidas. So overall on this slide, in the next probably, I would say, 1 to 3 years, we have, just by the ones that we can identify now, at least 20 million, right? If you look at JMZ, animal shelter, west side fencing, Avenidas, and then you start to balloon out if you add in the parks master plan and narrow down exactly the focus of that. Is it the 7.7 acres over at Foothill? Is it the 10.5 acres at Baylands, et cetera? You start ballooning out into much, much larger numbers. So now that we've given you all the problems, let's look at some of the potential options. So this is a review again from January when we discussed the infrastructure plan. So obviously we can look at reprioritizing projects, both within the infrastructure plan as well as other programmed capital projects. We will continue to look at new revenues. So we've talked about new hotels that are coming online. And that can generate additional tax revenues that we could also leverage from a debt perspective, or we could also look at tax increases. One example is TOT, an increase in that. So for an example, there's a rate 1% is about 1.7 million. Infrastructure-specific plan funding options that we've reviewed, again, as a council and committee, just to refresh your memory. The 5.7 that Brad already alluded to is very project-specific funding, so impact fees, or in lieu fees, I'm sorry, and SB1 funding. Obviously, we could defer projects, so if we look at those projects that are not yet underway, for example, Fire Station 4, those two new hotels, the Marriott hotels, with that estimated TOT from them, the additional capacity for debt issuance, assuming 70% of TOT, is 35 million on top of the TOT base of the 3.6 that the hotels would generate. Obviously, we can look at draining the reserves in the general
Could
capital
you just
fund.
say, we'd get the 3.6 on an ongoing basis and the 35 million?
You would get the 3.6 on an ongoing basis. That would be your TOT receipts, but then you could also issue an additional 35 million in debt.
But you still get the 3.6 and 35 million.
Correct.
That's the part that's
In 1 year.
confusing me.
Use the 3.6 to
I thought you
Correct.
used the 3.6 to pay the 35.
Yes.
In the long term, yes.
No, but so you don't get the 3.6. You paid off the 35 million.
We would
with the
get,
3.6.
we would get the 3.6, and we would use 70% of that
We
amount.
get 30% of
Correct.
3.6.
Yes.
Hopefully, I mean.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, can I ask a question on that?
Of course.
I mean, your sort of multiplier here, if I have $1, then I can finance $10 worth of capital
Yeah.
expenses. For our good friends to the south, Measure B, the grade separation, they were using a multiplier of like 25 or 30, okay? What's the difference? Okay, we're looking at 30 years, and you might be looking at 10 or something like that.
I'm sorry, let try it again.
All the financial estimates
Yes.
that I saw on particularly the grade separation project, countywide and so forth, suggested that they looked at that and said, if I have $1 of revenue per year, then I can finance $25 or $30 of capital expenditures, as opposed to 10. Why are they using different numbers than we are?
So it depends on credit rating, credit rate assumptions.
So you're assuming theirs is better?
Yeah, and the amount of leverage that you use. So we're being conservative at 70%. So somebody could argue that, maybe we could go 80 or 85.
Or 150%.
Yeah, so there's.
I saw a reference somewhere to 10 years' worth of horizon on it, too. Is that an element of that? And we're looking at 10 and they're looking at 30 or something like that?
So those are, that's another variable on the amount of time that we're looking at.
What are you looking at for this 35?
For this 35, it would be a 20-year.
So it's 20 years?
Yeah.
And if you went 30 years,
It's a bigger number.
it's a bigger, so maybe
Yeah.
they're doing 30 years.
Yeah,
And our ratio is more like 1 to 14, right?
that's correct.
Oh, because you get 70%.
That's right.
Correct.
Yeah. And so, and we believe that that's prudent, at least from my perspective, because if you do have a downturn, then you're not counting on the operating fund to pick it up, hopefully.
Okay, so I think moving on, kind of just providing a list to the committee of other financial options in terms of raising revenues. There's a list of potential ballot measures we can explore and discuss further in terms of estimates, options, timing, et cetera. And so we have obviously a property tax increase, and so that would be a bond issuance. You could do with a parcel tax. You could increase TOT, as we previously discussed. Documentary transfer tax, we could increase that rate. Utility users tax, when we modernized it, you will recall that the council approved a reduction in the rate. We broadened the base, but also reduced the rate. Business license tax, the city does not have. And then we can also continue to increase sales tax up to our cap. There's a cap that we are, as a local agency, able to hit.
How much do we have left in there? I mean, is it 0.25 or is it?
Yeah, I want to say it's about 0.25% that we have left
Yeah.
in capacity. And then this concludes our presentation, but ultimately I think the goal with the committee tonight is to discuss all of these priorities, hear your thoughts and feedback. Oh, I have another slide. next steps. I thought this through. So tonight, we're going to discuss and prioritize the committee's feedback, both of the funding options as well as on the expense side, the projects, the draws, so to speak. We hope to return back to the committee in March to review potential funding strategies, let us do our homework, and come back to you guys more educated. Sometime in April, continue to work on infrastructure. We also know we need to come back to the committee on pensions and policies surrounding that. We will have hearings in May with the committee to go over the FY19 city manager proposed budget, and then we still have June to have any city council actions. Obviously, we'll have budget adoption then, but any other further actions that we may need to take. So this is obviously a very high-level timeline. We're open to feedback and conversation depending on where this discussion goes.
Okay.
With that, I will turn it back to the chair.
So I see it as that there are really two buckets here. There's the bucket of infrastructure projects that we've been talking about and that we told the voters we would do. We're talking about finishing the public safety building, the garages, the bike bridge, the fire station, and some pedestrian and bicycle improvements, which we've already done some of the pedestrian and bicycle improvements. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, so it would have been helpful, but our shortfall, let me pull it up.
Say 56 million right now on the infrastructure plan.
So, wait. I think it's 56 million, but I think we need to be, I think we should add 15% to that. I was listening to Brad, and most of his things were 5 to 10%, and there's probably it's probably prudent to have another 5% in there for some of that stuff. I don't know if you think that. I mean, if we're going to start talking about which numbers to then figure out how to solve, you don't want to solve for 56 million and then be short another, $9 million on the public safety building, 1 million, that's 10, 16. And I start adding it up, and it starts to really come up. So, if you're at 56 million and you add 15%, what would you be at? 70 million, right? So that's my sense of what we should think about raising for that bucket. And, when I say raising, that's, the other thing we can do is we can look at deferring. I mean, there are those other things, but I think it's a $70 million shortfall. And, and the Bixby Park thing, I'm really concerned about that number. I think it would be great if you could give us a better number on that. And I don't know how easy it is to do, but that was done a long time ago too, and everything else went up 50%, so.
Can I say a couple quick things about that? One is that was based on an overall concept for the park, and now a lot of work has been done kind of as part of the closure of the landfill. I think the council's even seen some presentations and photos of things that look really nice.
Right.
Ultimately, the work that gets done out there could cost significantly less than this
Okay.
2.8 million. But the one other thing I'd like to say is it's completely funded through parks development impact fees. So it's not really fungible with the rest of this plan and the issues we face.
Okay, that's good to know. So really don't have to worry about that.
I'd agree with that.
Okay.
So I think there's two, I mean, if you were to say 70 million is the number, you've run that 70 million on the entire base of the projects that are in there. If you did choose to defer some projects, you may want to decide whether or not you deduct them and then run that percentage, or just stay overall with the 70 million. That being said, Kylie even identified some of the near known other issues that are out there, animal shelter, the JMZ.
So those
that's another
issues,
20 million.
I was going to say, I view this as
Exactly.
as solving one problem. And then I do think we have to decide as a committee, and we have a great opportunity, frankly, to say, okay, we have the animal shelter, we have History Museum, we have the second phase of the JMZ, there's a whole bunch of buckets. And what I'd like to see staff do is put those buckets together with numbers, and we can think about how to fund these things separately. And if we want to fund them, I mean, that's really the nexus. And I think we should think about some of the parks master plan and stuff in that. If we do go to the voters, last time we did this, what we did is we had staff poll. what we should do, we put different things together. We said, if we mix fire stations were popular, bike and pedestrian improvements were popular, history museum was very unpopular. Parking garages were like at 50%. The people said they'd vote for it. So there were different things that were more popular, and when you put these things together in different buckets when you went to the voters, you got different poll results, frankly. And different taxes. TOT taxes are wildly popular in Palo Alto. It passed at 78%. You are very likely to pass that. Other taxes, were less popular, and some of the taxes, like bond measures, require 2/3 majority. So, what I think we need them to do is to come back to us with getting some polling people to talk to us about how polling works, how we create a measure, how we look at that, look at what kind of taxes. And I think we all have to agree that there's really only two ways to fund the infrastructure. We're going to need to put a measure on the ballot if we're going to fund this. Otherwise, I don't see how we get to $70 million, frankly, and to do it. Now, on the $70 million, we could say that Marriott hotels, that would take off 35 of that, right? At which point you need to raise about $35 million, which seems a lot more manageable than $70 million. So I don't know that's something we can discuss, but that's an obviously easy way to say. And when we talked about our infrastructure plan, we did talk about new hotels would go to the infrastructure plan. And so I think that's really a no-brainer to say, let's make the Marriott hotels fund the infrastructure. That gives us $35 million. And then we basically need to close the other $35 million. We can talk about, if we want to cut stuff, we can talk about what we should go to the voters for, what that should look like, and how much money we should raise. And then I think we should talk about a separate measure, frankly, to fund, and we could mix and match the two if we wanted to, and we might decide to do that as a committee, to fund the other amount of money on a different measure that does it. Because some of those things could be more popular, but we're going to have to figure out from polling what's popular, what's not popular. I have a gut sense of it, but I could be wrong. Things could have changed. I'm basing it on what we polled last time we did the infrastructure stuff. So anyway, with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thank you. Well, a couple comments. From the staff point of view, I think it's pretty clear that the council's given us a directive as it relates to this core infrastructure plan. That's sort of a policy direction that we have. And we would generally be focused on how to accomplish that or accomplish as much of it as we possibly can with available funding sources. On that second bunch of items, while clearly we can see that there is a need, I think those do need those really need the direction from the committee and the council at this stage to say, we're really interested in this. We want you to look at how you can, how we include it. For example, last night you essentially gave us that direction on the JMZ as it relates to closing the gap. So the consideration of how to come up with that $4 million gap, that would be something that we could be working on with the committee. And but things like the animal shelter, what to do, I think those are some directives we'd want to get from you all to say, do we want to consider including those as near-term projects? And if so, how would we also sort of poll the community and whatever to see whether or not there are, whether there's an appetite for funding or supporting those? There'll probably be a few other of these items. Kylie, I don't know if we can put the schedule up that we had, the simple schedule for the months. A couple of items like the JMZ that will naturally be progressing and come forward. For example, the Avenidas project. We're coming back to the council in March. And we will have some suggestions as to how you could fund that $5 million gap. But for the most part, I do think that the committee, the reason I asked for that schedule is by the time we get into this March 2018 period, how do we start to assess what the possible package is, which means us, as the chair said, working with the pollsters that we've used to sort of assess if, what the possibilities for those things are. And then that being said, I just would say, if there is any ballot measure item that the council ends up recommending, they really need to do that by the end of June when you go on recess, because pretty much the first week in August, we would have to have everything ready for the election cycle to be able to meet the 2018 ballot. So I do think in the next 2 months, clearly you need to at least say, here's the universe of projects that we think are worthwhile and viable. Here's the approximate scope of the cost, and then look at how we would test how to fund some things. I do think that we should still expect that we should be focusing on value engineering these projects as much as we can without undermining them, and being open to considering deferring some projects and just saying maybe it's not the time to do those. I mean, I've made the point repeatedly that I think Fire Station 4 could be deferred. We certainly have a lot of challenges right now with Charleston or Astrodero, even where the funding is, and those may be other things that you want to be thinking about too. So we did run. We did get some data from during the rail committee process on a range of different yields on different revenue sources that we could also provide the committee. But I would say in a general sense, just even seeing what you saw with TOT and that sort of thing, and what these numbers are, if you leave things like Cubberley and the Parks Master Plan or something, which could be really, depending on the scale, could be really big expenditures. I'm just making it up. They could each be over $50 million. Depending upon the scale of them over time. But if you don't, and we're not really ready to deal with Cubberley, if you look at most of the rest of these things and the gap that you have in the main infrastructure plan, to me, those seem achievable by different combinations of revenues to be able to, maintain our course on that. We'll have to see ultimately where the community would be. My thoughts.
Right, I agree with all of those thoughts. Comments, questions?
I was going to ask about the Charleston or Astrodero plan, but I think you touched on it. So.
All right, comments, questions? No?
One question I have is, from the long-range forecast, aren't you already including in the Marriott numbers as future revenue to make sure that we are able to balance our budgets in those future years?
We have not included these two hotels specifically,
So on the long-range financial forecast, there's no money at all?
not associated with these two new.
Okay. Because I'm just trying to make sure that we're not double counting.
You and
Oh,
me
that's really
both.
good.
Thank you.
Great question.
You and me both.
Okay. Okay. And then what about the grade separations? Like funding that?
So I'll answer that since I'm on the rail committee. You're on the rail, well, you were on the rail committee. You can answer it too. I know, right? It's complicated.
I've been put it off the island.
So where we are on grade separations is, we're talking about ballot measures for this year. I do not believe that we're even close to coming up with a ballot measure for grade separations. We're going to have to choose a preferred alternative. We're not going to do that till at least the end of the year, and I think that's aggressive. If we can choose a preferred alternative on rail by the end of the year, I think we'd have done a great job this year and be good. And once we have the preferred alternative, then you move into the phase of how we fund it, because then you can start to figure out how much money are we talking about. And right now, the different alternatives range from, let's say, over $1 billion for what I call the mini trench down in Charleston and Meadow, to, to $4 billion if you did a full tunnel. right? So something along those range. So the point is that I don't believe that in this committee or now is really the time to worry about how to spend that. That's probably a different election cycle once we know what we want to do. Okay.
Well, I can just say one thing from many, many years of experience in going to the ballot, and I'm sure that any of the consultants, if we bring FM3, who's sort of our go-to firm, would tell you that it's generally really hard to get a successful vote if you don't have a clearly identified project and purpose and, be able to really explain how it's going to be used and what the benefits are. So, we really have got to work through the winnowing down process in the Rail Committee on the grade separation issue. And even though there are huge demands for meeting a construction schedule in the 2020 decade, I think that when we discuss this with the Rail Committee, it'll be pretty clear that there's not an urgency for us to have revenues available before 2020 anyway, so.
And I think we should address Carberley up front, too. I also don't believe we should talk about Carberley in terms of this. I think Carberley, we have the same issue. We do not yet have a plan with the school district or how we want to spend the money. And so I think that's beyond the scope of this.
And just to remind you, the lease is up 2020, so we still need to negotiate even that piece before we get to the master plan.
Now, in the Parks and Rec master plan, I actually think there are elements of the park master plan that we should possibly think about funding. We have the 10 acres, frankly. Every time we delay on that, a generation of children are not getting to use that 10 acres. So, I do think that we should think about some of those things. And I'm not sure, I would actually like to see Rob, and it's what, Kristen? Working with the Parks and Rec Committee, starting to put together a list of projects that they believe are well-defined, clearly articulated, that we could think about funding.
I'm sure they would enjoy that.
So the 56 million, it takes into account all the grants that is mentioned here for each of the projects?
So the other thing we might want to do, and I got this from Councilmember Filsath, or Vice Mayor Filsath, was there is certain opportunities to buy parkland, and we don't have enough parkland. Right, there was that 7 acres, or where?
There's the 1 acre AT&T by.
Right, the 1 acre AT&T part I was thinking of. And it might be nice if we had a fund where we had money to buy that. Because they know a lot of people want to buy that site. So I don't know where we are as a city in thinking about the ability to buy that. But it's something like those kind of things we should, when staff puts together a list of projects, we should think about the things that people have really talked about that they want. And I know that AT&T site has come up many times.
We're monitoring that situation. They're put forward their realignment of the lots, and it's going through that process. It's not final. Just to remind you, what they told us is that they expect a competitive process. What we asked is that since we're a public agency, that they try to give us some heads up so we can react accordingly.
Well, we also have the power of eminent domain. And I think the power of eminent domain for parks and something like that is absolutely something we should consider.
In terms of funding, not to get too specific with this one, but some of the things that I think staff would recommend to you is to look at some of your stranded assets. You have a couple lots on Middlefield that are not being utilized. They're in a residential area that you could consider selling to purchase parkland, so for example.
That might be smart.
So I remember Santa Clara Supervisor Summidian they had a fund for Magical Bridge. If you were going to do a park like Magical Bridge, would that be something that we might, I mean, is there funds still available? Would we be able to use that to get a grant for that parcel that you were mentioning?
Let us follow up. I did read that there was an appropriation specifically set up, but I don't know what the criteria is for those particular uses, but it's related to the concept of the magical bridge. So let us look into it and see what that criteria is and see if we would be able to participate in that process.
That'd be super.
So I think in terms of next steps, staff for March, when you come back in March, are you coming back with a polling firm, or is that too early to do that, to have them start to explain what they want to do? And I'm sort of guessing.
I think we could do that. I mean, it's look at for your direction. I can tell you that we don't need the council authorization to engage with the polling firm. I mean, the cost of that is within the authority of the city manager's contracting authority, and that's typically the way we've done it in the past. So we would, we'd be good to get your direction that you're interested in us doing that for sure, and we could be ready to have them come back and talk to you about the process. And I mean, some of you are familiar with working with these firms. Some of you will be new, but I think it'll be interesting and educational, and they'll be able to give you a lot of perspective, not only on what it takes for things to be successful, but I mean, what's the general mood of the electorate? How do things work in a general election that's a non-presidential election? To what extent do you have to be concerned about ballot fatigue or whatever, and all of those kinds of things. So
I would be comfortable giving staff a nod on that one now.
I would too. So let's talk about it overall and see if we can come to an agreement on what we should do. Staff should come back with a polling firm. That you've got the direction on that if we're all in agreement. I don't know, are we all in agreement?
I have some comments.
Okay.
Questions or comments?
You can do either.
Okay, well, let me know.
Oh, go ahead.
So I thought about what the city manager said in terms of the need to value engineer and prioritize. And I think before we go out and ask our citizens for more taxes, I think we owe it to ourselves to really make sure that we really thought hard about these projects and prioritize them, that we value engineer the heck out of them before we ask people to open up their pocketbooks. Because the feeling I have is that a lot of people already feel like they pay a lot of taxes, right? People look at the property tax bill and they're like, wow, this is a lot of money. And my feel also is that I'm not necessarily sure that the city is as optimal as it could be in terms of getting bids and getting contracts. So I think we need to get a better handle on that before I'll be in favor of increasing our taxes. Oh, one other question I just thought of, which is, so where was the Marriott money allocated to before?
For
Where did you put
the
it?
new hotels?
Yeah.
We didn't include it.
Anywhere?
No.
Okay.
It doesn't, it's not alive
fine.
yet.
Okay, I agree with I agree with Councilman Tanaka in that we need to really look hard at value engineering, looking hard at making sure that, we are doing the best we can on that kind of stuff. I think we all would probably believe that. Councilman Ku.
Just another thing, on table 3, I believe, I was wondering if there's any way to add another column in there to show what the grants are so that we know how much actually, updated conceptual over here for the public safety, but, well, that one is not a good one because it doesn't have grants. Charleston or Rostadero, for example, I understand 4 million is what we have to come up with, or is that the gap?
I don't believe that table 3 is not trying to show what the current gap is. Unless
Right.
I've got the tables mixed up. I
Well,
think that would be
so I'm
table
not
5.
specifically, okay, I'm not specifically talking about the gap, but more, just basically more columns to show, okay, if the whole cost is 10 million, then what is our portion and what is the grant portion?
I
Just so-
understand.
Okay.
Yes.
Can I try to rephrase it slightly? Because I think it's a really good question, which is, we're looking at these where you say, gee, if we pushed this one out a few years, we'd save this much money. But I think what Councilmember Kuh's asking is that really true? Because some of these things may have, money earmarked for them that's not fungible to other things.
Right.
And so it's
So like a great example would be the Highway 101 bike pedestrian bridge where we're saying it's a $16.3 million project, but we have $8.35 million in grants and $1 million currently from Google
Right.
supporting
So
that.
you couldn't just free up $16 million by saying, we're going to do that in 2023.
It kind of will help, when we're looking through this, so we know exactly the funds
Yeah,
that we have to
That's a
show.
good idea. We can do that.
If we could have that.
I
And
think
then,
that'd be useful, too.
also, another thing I was looking at on the packet, page 62, I mean, it's great that you have all the design steps. So is there any way that you would be able to kind of provide an average from conceptual design to actually awarding the contract? What is the average delta that you see at these projects? And if you might be able to also add it in, so we can kind of factor it in when we're reading all of this in the table? I don't know if that's too much. I mean, an average. Because obviously, we see that from when 2012, you guys decided, when we decided on the project, a lot has changed in the pricing. As a matter of fact, as I was looking at the infrastructure costs, it was like, a lot of them were half more than it was back then.
That's right. And so is what you're looking for, where we get from conceptual at the beginning, like all the way to the end, where we have that?
To when
Or-
we award the contract to whichever contractor we're going to be using.
Right.
Is
Yeah.
that possible
No,
to get
we
kind of
we
the-
can do that. Are you thinking just for these projects?
Well,
Because we can do that. The issue right now is that only one of them is so far at the point where we think we have the final costs. The Fire Station 3 project that I was mentioning.
Well, the reason I asked for that, even the ones that hasn't, does not have the actual cost, if you could include that number in there, then we can see far down the line what it increases to. Does it make sense?
I think I understand what you're saying. What I think you're actually seeing is also just a evolution of staff's ability to forecast these costs.
And the rising costs.
Right. And they've become, to Brad and his team's credit, have become more sophisticated in projecting these costs in that, he's able to give us those estimates of, these are the costs for every month that's going to compound if it delays. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is naturally, you shouldn't see that significant of a change across this process to the extent your scope stays the same and you built in the right contingencies from the get-go. And I think as a whole, and the timing, right? So the inflation costs. As a whole, the PW team is working on and has done a really good job of revising how they do this. So these new costs are looking at not only just current day estimates, but when it's going to happen, the rise in inflation costs between now and when the project's going to happen.
So it's already been looked at. It's
So-
factored in.
We're actively looking at it, I would say.
Okay.
I don't want to say that it's perfect, because when this chart gets completed on every one of these projects and the costs continue to escalate from today all the way through, I don't want to be on record saying that they won't. But I do think that the PW team as a whole is becoming much more sophisticated as they're working their way through these projects. So that council has a much better idea of the estimated costs of them across the forecasted period.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I was just looking at slide 4 again, and Councilmember Ku kind of made me think about this. So we have staff salary and benefits at 6.5 million, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And is that allocated across all the projects above there, or this is, or is there a staff and salary benefits embedded in some of these other numbers?
I'll let Brad take that.
It's allocated throughout all the projects.
But we have this additional 6.5 here as well.
No, the 6.5 is essentially, if you were to go to the budget document, you would see numbers that are different than what we show you in currently budgeted, because they would include the staff salaries and benefits. But to make it easier to actually compare these figures to the original infrastructure plan figures from 2014, which did not include staff salaries and benefits, we've shown it this way. So you're able to compare the current estimate to the original estimate, but still see on the bottom line what the total staff salaries and benefits figure is.
I see. Do you know what is the percentage of the staff salaries and benefits for each project? Because I wonder, like for like projects like the 101 bike bridge, which has been going on for a long time, that might have like a very significant chunk of staff costs versus some other ones might be very little.
We could show that, yeah, and I agree with you, it does vary widely. So, for instance, on a project like Fire Station 3, we had funding, we went through the design process, and here we are, it's under construction. I don't think we've spent that much on salaries and benefits. On the Bike Bridge project, it's had stops and starts and a lot of time invested in a design competition, and it has a much higher salaries and benefits figure.
Just so we're clear, these are budget plans for the projects, which include projected costs for the project, for the remainder of the project, and it would also include costs that have already been paid to a project to the extent you've had staff already working on it. So it is designed to be the total cost of the staff time allocated to this set of projects, essentially from beginning to completion.
So do you want to follow up on that? You look like you do.
I do, but I'm waiting to see.
So just to be clear,
Maybe you're going to follow up.
just to be clear, so the 6.5 is all the staff costs that has ever been incurred and ever will be incurred for these projects. Is that the way you think about it?
But it would be an obsolete number because they could change. I think earlier, right, if, for example, you ask us to redesign something, then we would have to add
No, I understand that.
additional.
But I mean, for at least the foreseeable future, it's 6.5. That's been all the costs so far, and all the costs will be in the future, assuming nothing else changes. Okay, but what's missing here is that we don't know that maybe some projects like the bridge might be like a huge percentage, and some other ones like the fire station may be a small percentage, right? Is that?
Correct.
Okay. When could you guys provide the percentages?
Yeah, I'd like to see that too. Also, I'm really curious on some of this, on the staff costs. So let's say the Charleston Arastadero project has been around, I think, since I was born. So there must be a ton of staff time that's been gone into that back and forth. If we decide not to do that, what happens to those staff costs?
Those would become a sunk cost.
Yeah.
I mean,
Can I-
we
can I-
better be booking those costs against those projects when we close them out.
But how does that work? I mean, there's no money then. I mean, we say we're saving, you have $3 million in staff, I'm making it up, obviously. It's in Charleston Arastadero, we decide not to do it. And then we say, okay, we've now saved $15 million off our infrastructure plan. But you've already spent that. You've paid those salaries. You've done all of that. So what happens to this $6.5 million? I've always thought this was on a going forward basis of staff costs, not a looking back, because who do we pay back? The general fund suddenly gets the money back?
And I'd say it's
And then I
not
move-
just the salaries and benefits. These figures are not just looking forward. They include all of the soft costs like design services that have already been incurred on the projects.
So if we've incurred money on the projects, I mean, I guess I'd like to look and see what we still need to incur, because that's what we have to raise. If we spent the money, look, if we spent the money, we spent the money.
Right.
And I don't understand who we pay back by putting it in here. I guess that's what I'm trying to understand.
Well, I mean, one of the things is the budgeted versus current estimates is just the budget plan and estimates. It's not an accounting for what we've spent. We don't have a column in here that would say expenses to date in each one of these projects,
Right.
which we also do have. I mean, the fact is, I mean, we do not account to the quarter of an hour of staff time on every project. We basically use a general kind of cost
I was
allocation
thinking every
model.
6 minutes, that's what lawyers
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that degree of extra accounting has its own cost to it that compounds all of the pricing.
I don't know, ask Terrence, if you've counted his billing, I bet he's older than he looks.
Can I make one more point
Yeah.
on the salaries and benefits issue, is just that with the question about the salaries and benefits in each project, if you look at attachment C to the staff report, we've actually provided a table that does show that project by project.
Let's see, right?
I think it's the very last page of the report.
It's this.
Yes.
Why does yours look more useful? Mine is small.
All right, let me see if I can, give me a second. Let me see if I can pull it up.
I am looking at the printout of the report from January 22nd, so maybe there was a mistake in the print.
It looks like Chair has it, it's just not.
So that is.
Is this the one that shows up? She just gave me a short report.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Why do I have a different one than anyone else?
I have no idea.
So the reason I was going there was, all I wanted to know was, how much more money do we need?
Actually, can you fill that wide?
Yeah, let me see.
Are you asking, Chair, specifically about that project right now, or just when we come
In
back,
general, when
you'd
you
like
come
to
back.
have that?
I'd like to know how much money we need.
Right. Or how much, by another way of saying that would be, how much do we save if we removed a project or deferred it?
Just a little background, we used to have all the salary and benefits charged to one capital project and not allocated to projects. But maybe 6 years ago, Finance Committee said, no, we like to see the allocation, at least for the current project. So that's how this originated.
And just so we're clear, too, these are the direct costs for the projects. We don't do allocated overhead charges. So, for example, the fact that we're all in here sitting with you guys talking about this right now, we're not billing our time to the project. Yes, it's not part of it.
All right. Any questions?
We don't allocate Nielsen back there either.
No, we do allocate we keep a running tally of our allocated charges to Nielsen, but we don't actually book it.
All right. So I think the other thing I think I wanted to briefly talk about is, you have a list of different ballot measure options here. I'm not sure this is the meeting where we bring that down, but, I mean, I think, for instance, for the infrastructure plan and for the other, and for what I would call the community projects, the business license tax is probably not the right one. We've been talking about using a business license tax to fund transportation at some point. And so I'm not sure that that's the right one, but we can obviously talk about it. I'm not sure the sales tax increase is the right one either for those two things. And the reason I say that is that the sooner we narrow down these, the easier it is to have the polling, to have all of that. So I don't think we should have staff spend a lot of time on ones that the committee, the four of us, are not interested in looking at for those two measures. Not to say that we wouldn't use these for other things, but that's, so, I mean, for parks and for a lot of the community stuff, property tax may make sense. Parcel tax might make sense. I don't know. I do think our documentary transfer tax is low compared to other cities. I know I've seen stuff like that, but I'm not necessarily advocating for that either. But I mean, I think staff should come back, look at these, and make some suggestions when they come back to us in March about that, and we as a committee could think about what we want to do. But I don't think we want to go through every single possible tax and have staff spend the time and effort to do that, if we're not going to do that. Utility users tax, for instance, we just went to the voters on that. I mean, I don't know. It seems a reach to ask the voters again now to raise that, but I could be wrong. I mean, this is sort of a gut sense. But I do think we need to think about that and make that decision fairly quickly.
Well, the fundamental issue behind the $56 to $70 million gap, construction costs are going up in the Bay Area. I mean, it's getting more and more expensive to live here, right, as the area generates more wealth and more people come here, but the amount of land remains the same.
Correct.
Right? So, in my mind, we're all, as a community, just going to have to accept it's going to cost us more to get these kinds of things. Right? And so, whether it's, I think you raised an interesting point for thought, right, as to which kinds of revenue and so forth. But at some level, I think we gotta have the expectation if we want these kinds of things, then we're going to have to pay more for them because of the dynamics of the boom in Silicon Valley. And so, at some level, that's going to affect whether it's a business tax or a sales tax or a parcel tax or a hotel tax or whatever. It's a utilities user tax. Even though we went out to them last year for utilities tax, that's the way it is, right? And so it's 90 million foot speech.
Right. My point was more that I think that we should take the time when we leave here. I wanted to focus people that these are the different taxes. We should come to a discussion. I don't think we should make a decision tonight, obviously. I'm saying we should think about it. I wanted to focus everyone that these were what staff was thinking of in different taxes, and we should have that discussion.
You've asked a question that I'm going to go think about.
Right.
Which is, you were used to thinking about this as, okay, well, if we want to, how would we fund this and so forth? Well, the other end of that is, well, this kind of lever and that kind of lever, what's the appropriate uses for those kinds of levers? And I haven't thought about that. I'm going to go think about that.
And it's also, there's a practical aspect to it of different taxes are received differently by the voters. And at the end of the day, we have to get 51% for some taxes and 2/3 for other taxes. And that plays a big role in it because you got to win. Otherwise, you get nothing.
So which ones are the 51 and which ones are the
49%, you don't get
2/3?
half of no.
I believe,
As long as they're general,
as long as they're general, right?
you get simple majority.
So if there's a
But not on a
general-
bond. You can't do a simple majority bond, can you? I thought bonds were always 2/3.
GO's 2/3.
So the other 2/3 on the bonds, property tax typically, or if it was a parcel tax even.
So parcel tax and property tax are typically 2/3, right? That's what I thought.
All the others, for the most part, are if we use it for a general purpose as opposed to a specified purpose. A specified purpose, it's 50%. However, if we were to just, for example, say we wanted to go out for a tax to fund the public safety building, just in and of itself, that would be for a special purpose. That would need a 2/3 vote.
But we would never do that. What we would say is, here's the advisory measure, this is what we're going to spend it on, that's what we've always done. And I don't think, I'd say I wouldn't want to spend any time on this committee saying that we should go out for a 2/3 tax when we can put in a 50% tax by simply having an advisory measure.
And those are things when we bring in our consultants too, who can kind of, give you a lot of texture and details on how all of these things work and what the pros and cons of them are, and, if you want a particular way, what's the best way to structure it to be effective.
Do you guys feel like you have enough direction from us? Or do you need more direction?
So I would say one thing. I do agree with Councilmember Tanaka's comments that it's important that we kind of pursue all options. I would also say, though, that we can't do this in an entirely linear process. We have to do some parallel work. And then it doesn't mean you make a decision by us doing this work. We're going to get at some point down the road, and then you'll maybe have enough convergence between value engineering, potential realignment of priorities, and what the revenue streams are to be able to make that decision. But we would need to pursue gathering data on sort of what the public response would be to projects and all of those things in polling. concurrent with as we're working on value engineering and some of those other things. Because some of the projects just aren't far enough along for us to maximize what we would do in value engineering, for example. So it's like everything, you just have to juggle, a few balls in the air at the same time.
I think the only clarity that might help us is on the ballot measure option. If there's an item there that you definitely don't want us to pursue, it would save us time, because we're trying to work on the budget as well at the same time.
Well, correct, but I think we can make that decision in March. I didn't want to force people to try and make that decision tonight.
Fair enough. We can
And I
give,
do think you need to come back to us a little bit with a little bit of information. I'm not sure everyone has information. Like, I'd like to know where we are compared to other cities. Are other cities going out on documentary transfer taxes recently? I want staff to think a little bit about this. Utility users tax, is this a good time to go out for that? Maybe it's just a polling question. What are we likely to win on? What are we likely to get this stuff passed on?
yeah, and we can provide you that. We've done some preliminary research, for example, on the TOT increase, and we're on the high end. Now, there's an asterisk on that, because there's other add-on taxes that tourism tax, for example, on hotels. So there's other components of how others have done it. But we can do that, and we can give you a comparison on documentary transfer tax. Some cities in the county, for example, don't have it, others do. And what do they have, and how do we compare to others in the
I think
peninsula?
there's some cities that have recently sort of gone out to
Yep.
raise their documentary transfer
Yes.
tax.
And, right now, just to remind you, it's $3.30 per thousand. That's what it is.
That's probably a useful exercise, because I think that's one of the ones that sort of strikes most of us as sort of maybe one of the most likely.
To me, the TOT tax, the documentary transfer tax, possibly, a utility users tax are interesting. And for, funding parks and that kind of stuff, maybe some sort of parcel tax or property tax. But I'm concerned that it's 2/3, and I think that's a really high bar.
It's a simple majority if you keep it general.
Okay, so we can keep it general with an advisory measure and still do a property tax
Yeah.
increase?
It's when you do a
So-
special tax or GO, then it becomes a supermajority.
So those are the ones that interest me, the property tax, the parcel tax, TOT, the documentary transfer tax, utility users tax. For those items, I think if we were doing transportation, and a sales tax increase is an interesting one, but I think we should save that for something else, and I'm not sure what, but I don't know why I think that. Because we've had discussions about it. On the other hand, the first.
A lot of sales tax paid by residents.
It is. No. I'm fine with sales tax, so we should consider that. The other advantage to the sales tax is that we're only allowed to go to 10, whatever it is. There's a quarter left, and other people could grab it if we don't.
Lest the county do it.
Right, that's what I mean. So
right.
we might want to grab that and grab it now and fund stuff. So I'm good with that, too.
And just for context on the sales tax, 2 other jurisdictions in our county have individual sales tax of 0.25%. So for example, San Jose just passed their sales tax increase specific to their district.
Oh, they just did?
Mm-hmm.
So,
A few years ago.
Are they at the cap?
Yes.
so we should probably seriously consider a sales tax increase then.
I'm not sure the year that they went, but it's been in the last, 3 years maybe.
Do you guys also know, I know that Mountain View had looked at their increasing revenues and doing something. Have you looked at what they were doing?
I think they're just beginning the discussions, but we will look at it and bring you that.
They probably weren't at the cap before Measure B.
I'm sorry, say that again?
San Jose probably was not at the limit before Measure B.
That's correct.
Just, I was trying to remember what the documentary transfer tax rate was in Berkeley. I remember it was high, so
It's very high. It's like
yeah,
9.
It's more than, ours is $3.30, and Berkeley is at $15.
It's at
so-
15, right.
And actually, a lot of the Alameda County cities are at $12 and $13.
Well, that's why I
Henryville
said I
and
saw them. I saw them as
Albany,
being really high in Alameda County.
I think we also have to remember their prices are a lot more or less than what we have over here. Their real estate prices, right?
Yeah,
So
they're
it does.
significant, but they're not the level. we have.
Right, so when you do $3.30 per thousand,
Well, and as we look at sales tax, of course, that is leveling off anyway. So the calculations on estimates of what that's going to raise over time is not what it would have been 5 or 10 years ago.
That's true, it's leveling off. Whereas those documentary transfer taxes are, rising.
On the additional capital funding needs for, the ones on page 8, will you be adding it to your tables so that we look at them, or is this a separate set?
So I think what we
Bundle?
heard, at least from the chair, and then will be good feedback for us, that the suggestion was to have 2 buckets, one for the infrastructure plan, I call it, and the other for these type of projects. If that's the direction the committee wants to give us, that's how we'll allocate them.
And with the specific exemption on Cumberly out of that mix, right?
Correct, and
No grade SEPs, no coverage.
Right.
And did that include the operating as well from the preceding slide?
You've lost me.
Yeah.
So I think she's wondering, when we are trying to bucket what our outstanding obligations are, or that are coming up rather, do we want to include all of the outstanding operating costs as we're looking at this, or do you want us to just keep those to the side?
Maybe that's the third bucket, operating costs.
So we
I'm
could do-
unclear what you mean by operating
So
costs.
operating costs, pension, right, if we want to start adding additional contributions to our pension costs to pay down UAL.
I think that's a third bucket.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah.
Not
That's a
so sure.
loser, by the way.
Yeah, totally agree.
Just confirming
Yeah.
that's not included.
Right, yeah.
I
I
just
think
think like
definitely
ask
it's
people
not.
that.
I mean, just to be clear, the direction that the committee is giving us is not to turn to the general fund as it is now and find additional money, which would be putting us into competition with operating costs. This is to see how do we get the costs down on the projects on the demand side, and then what's a new supply of revenue that we could find for this purpose. And Vice Mayor's point's exactly right. We're not talking about pension obligation bonds or anything like that, so.
All right. Yeah, sure.
I just got this packet page, so I'm just looking at it now. For some reason, I'm the only one that didn't get it, but
Yeah, there it is.
yeah. So, I'm looking at this, I'm looking at page 4 of our slide. I don't know if you guys could, well, you guys have to look at it manually, but,
Page 4.
so I'm just trying to match these up. The numbers are a little bit different, but that's okay. The thing that I'm just puzzling over is when you go from 180 million to 235 million, the staff salaries and benefits are the same, but because I'm looking at the salary benefits, the second to last column on packet page 75, and I guess I'm just trying to understand. So is there really no increase at all? So we go from 180 to 235 or 236 million, right? So the 6.5 is everything, even.
If we were adding new projects, that could be a driver that would change, but they're keeping the projects the same. They just have escalating costs associated with the projects themselves.
if there's project delays and there's salary increases and therefore benefit increases, the cost could drive up too.
Okay. So when it says budgeted plus actual, what does that mean?
So to your earlier question of, does the 6.5 include money that we've spent on salaries? This chart is telling us that yes, it does. And just a quick note, the reason why this total project funding looks different than the slide that you're looking at, I don't remember what slide number that is, I
4.
apologize. 4, thank you, is we're looking on slide 4 at the projected costs for these projects, whereas this matrix that we're looking at for the 180 million was what's currently budgeted for those projects. So actually, if you look at the initial column on slide 4, the 179.8 is the same as the 179.8 on what we're looking at right now, the allocations. And so ultimately now the project costs have risen from a construction standpoint, and we're kind of making some forecasts as to where we think the project costs will be. And also just a quick note for Councilmember Koo, this also talks about the grants as well.
And everything. This is exactly what I was thinking.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Anything else? Anything else from committee members? No?
Okay.
Actually, last question, which
Last
is,
question, go ahead.
so when are we going to prioritize?
I think at the next meeting, we're
Next
going to
meeting?
start
Okay.
talking about it. Right.
I'm sorry,
He
could
wants to
you
know,
repeat
when are we
that?
going to prioritize stuff?
How so?
So to the extent that you're going to say, are there some projects that would be deferred or something like that?
I think at the next meeting, you could definitely do that with the infrastructure plan first bucket. The second bucket, there's going to be some,
Right, the second, but we're not ready yet.
right, because we are going to try to do the first cut, and then you're going to see our recommendations, and then you're going to make those calls in the budget hearings. And then there's some that are going to be obvious to you that are not in there
So in the
that,
second bucket, I don't think so in the budget.
well,
The second budget is question, do we want to go to a ballot measure for the second budget?
so there's some that, yes, and so,
There's really a third bucket of stuff that goes in the budget here.
sure,
Right,
we
which
can
is your
split it up that
CIP
way.
and
Yeah,
that kind
we,
of stuff.
it
That's
makes
really
it
a
cleaner.
different- there's-
Yeah.
In my view, this finance has the infrastructure plan, what I call the second bucket items, animal shelter. Community investment. Why don't we just call it community investment? I like that. But community investment is the second, right? Then we have, in a third bucket, we have pensions and that kind of stuff we need to talk about. And then we have the budget that we do every year. And then obviously we have all of the, what do you call it? You know, all the utility stuff that comes to us. Nilsen, you have a?
Just a point of order. Do the people in the community have a chance to talk?
Sure. Would you like to speak?
We never called for oral.
We never called for oral communications. You know, I wish you'd remind me.
Appreciate the opportunity to come and sit through these meetings, which I think.
Microphone.
More than I really want
Nielsen,
to do.
microphone.
I appreciate the opportunity to attend these meetings because it's fulfilling a need that I have, is to better understand why the council acts the way it does. So as I said before, I really decided I wanted to follow the money. So this is my 20th hour or something like that, sitting through the build-out of the budget. I've heard all the departments coming in, and I continue to feel it's a very good process. And I am reluctant to even comment very much because I don't think I have enough grasp of what you're doing, other than I've got a fair amount of confidence about it. Jim, you said something very quietly in the beginning of a council meeting not too long ago, and it really caught my eye because it triggered what I don't understand. And at a previous meeting, you've commented on how we're going to communicate this to the public. And you really hit me in between the eyes because you talked about the average assessment of a home is $600,000. Well, that's me. And you're getting about $600. You, the city, is getting about $600 of that.
Yeah, and the property tax.
Property tax side.
Yeah.
Well, here's some hints. For my little 8-unit condominium, I pay $1,000 a year for mediocre management. I pay more than that for my cell phone. So I don't know how to turn that into something individuals can understand. But it's a piece of the communications that I don't hear discussed here. That's all I was going to say tonight. But the comment about the sliver of sales tax that's left for grabs, I didn't quite hear the pucker factor. If I were you guys, I would be really worried about other people grabbing that first, if it's possible. I don't know the mechanics, but I just heard that discussion. I read a lot of newspapers. I read every frigging newspaper every day up and down the peninsula. If those of you not on the newsletter, then you you could get a digest of that. But there are more people planning to go to the public pocket. Los Altos Mountain View School is at over $250 million. And I'm beginning trying to add all that up. And it's not, many of them are very needy and deserving, there's no question about it. And if anybody could do that barn raising, this region should. If you're from where I grew up in Mississippi, there's no barn building potential. It's just simply sliding to hell and back. So I just think you need to be really careful about figuring out what the public is going to tolerate, because the thing that we don't know, and the pollsters apparently don't know at all, but the federal SALT, state and local tax thing, really is going to complicate people's propensity to pony up money, because the perception is I can't write it off. Well, my overall tax rate may be better, but I can't write it off. And I don't think anybody's dealt with the high-income states and what's going to be happening. The governors are all in the twit, as you know, but I put that down into your great uncertainties on, because I don't think a pollster can tell you how the individual taxpayers are thinking, because none of us have thought through our federal taxes. And some people, it's a major hit. For me, it's not. In fact, I'm willing to give $100,000 for a good rail car to fix, because I figured out, hey, that my property would be worth a lot more. It's a direct benefit for me, but because I'm in a unique situation, because I'm not paying any taxes to speak of. And I've got free cash. I could do that. It'd be like Belt's bookstore. She prepaid the parking assessment district, and so I don't think I'm typical at all. But I think the uncertainty is typical. And I think I went way over my time. Thank you.
Kathy Durham.
I will try to be very brief. I actually was intending to speak about next steps regarding project priorities, which apparently you're not doing tonight. But I'll throw this comment out for you to reflect on for whenever it is that you do this. When you're considering these infrastructure projects, what I am struck by is how they are not framed or presented with reference to our city's sustainability goals. And I've been involved since 1998. There have been plans, priorities, goals, number one items, et cetera, importance of shifting the mix of mobility choices. And we really haven't done a very good job about doing that at the city level. We have now fairly aggressive target in reducing greenhouse gases. Okay, 40% of those gases are generated by transportation. The largest chunk of that is single occupancy motor vehicles. But when we're looking at these budgeted costs and shortfalls, where is that in any consideration of prioritizing? I don't see that here. That doesn't mean that it hasn't been energy doing that. But I liked what Councilmember Sharp said about what's already been spent, sunk into a project that you're not going to get back, versus what is the incremental, the cost to get to finishing it, to complete it. Because if you look at these, there's the shortfall, and then some of them are projects that now have tens of millions over. You know, some of them will only take a small amount to get there. When you're making those decisions, you know, look at reducing congestion versus managing congestion, subsidizing daytime housing for cars versus other things you could be doing with that money. And it's not an either or, but it is you have to have the big picture of, and not always sacrifice for the immediate urgent need of housing for cars to shifting the priorities in our local trips, and the big picture items like rails, shifting priorities for our long distance trips. And yeah, please consider climate change, the future for our children, all of that wonderful stuff, and not just these little columns that you've got there today. How you put that into a number, I don't know, but it would be good to communicate that. It would really, really be helpful in terms of prioritizing, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Are we ready to adjourn? Anyone else have any?
Future meetings agenda?
Oh, yeah.
Our next meeting is the 20th of this month. We're bringing you 3 items, 2 related to utility, hydroelectric, water adjustment policy, and then the review of the downtown parking management study.
You're bringing this issue back to us?
This one comes back on, Kylie, March 20th, right? The coming back with this issue.
We will do our best.
And the next one's March 6th, is that it?
Yes, and at this point, there's no agenda items on March 6th. But we need some time to do this.
So
Homework.
but right now, we have February 20th,
20th
20th, and that's the two that we have nothing on March 6th right now.
at this point, and then March 20th is the continuation of this, and we put / pension in case you wanted to talk about some high-level policies that we could propose.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you all. We got out before 9 o'clock. That's a good plan.
We did. We get started at 6.